The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is my favorite game of all time. I have never had this much joy revisiting and re-exploring a video game setting. The gameplay mechanics are built on some technical wizardry. It's got everything I loved about its predecessor while also addressing every single one of my complaints. But the thing that really stuck out to me is how the story was not sacrificed, even if the way the story was told suffered from an unfortunate side effect of player freedom. The more freedom given to the player, the less control the developer has in terms of structure, pacing, and exposition. But the most unique spin in this game, and one a lot of players were not fond of, was the way it rewrites and retcons the timeline from the prior games. Now, I'm not going to pretend the timeline ever really mattered or that Nintendo ever really cared, but a lot of people did. So it was really weird to see these cutscenes mash together parts of Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword with brand new lore about the Zonai. There's plenty of evidence from landmarks to outfits to special weapons and even explicit lines of dialogue to suggest that the prior games happened, just not in the way we experienced them in the other games, which is the most widely accepted definition of a legend. To go any further, we have to go back before Zelda, before Nintendo, before World War II, all the way back to the start of the 17th century when Japan first got a peek of the outside world. The Dutch weren't technically the first Europeans to touch down on the land of Nippon, but they were the first and for a long time only country to have sustainable trade relations. Among the many goods and services between the two groups, there was a great religious exchange. The importance of the Bible within European literary traditions can never be understated. In fact, it can be a little overbearing. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church basically had a monopoly on educational resources. There's this crackpot theory that Christianity's domination of Europe held society back, but if that were true, then every other region in the world would have rocketed ahead of Europe, which didn't really happen. The Middle East were able to keep a decent pace of advancement, but it didn't take Europe long to catch up and surpass everyone else during the Renaissance. But yeah, if you're in Europe between 500 and 1400 and you want to know how to read and write, better join a monastery where all your efforts will be spent reading and copying down the Bible. It's for this reason that a lot of pagan European stories have lost their original context. Even those interested in codifying older traditions had to secure funding from the church and were therefore held under religious scrutiny, which is why many Celtic, Norse, and Germanic heroes, gods, and monsters got rewritten as saints, angels, and demons. The first Legend of Zelda is a stripped-down, bare-bones hero story that would fit right in with some of the stuff in the Prose Edda. There's a hero who saves a princess from a monster. All the extra bells and whistles were added later. There's not even anything particularly special about his sword. The most powerful weapon in the game is the silver arrows you get in the final dungeon. Silver has always been a weakness of monsters and magic, because even ancient people were able to observe its antimicrobial properties long before they knew the source of those properties. Ganon was made to look like a pig for what I can only assume was a reference to Journey to the West. Zelda herself was named after Zelda Fitzgerald, wife of famous novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was also an accomplished novelist in her own right. The name Link is actually a holdover from when the game was going to be sci-fi, an element that has actually been strangely omnipresent in the series. And the last element from the original game I want to address is the Bible. It's just a straight-up Bible, because Nintendo was envisioning this as a Christian European fantasy with even more explicit ties to Christianity than even Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which also helped inspire the game. Zelda 2 kept a lot of these folkloric elements intact and added in a dose of Sleeping Beauty for its plot, and that brings us to A Link to the Past. Link to the Past kept a lot of the Christian elements, like the sanctuary being modeled after a Catholic church, and Link praying at one point. There is also a lot more influence from Arthurian legends. This is the game that introduced the Master Sword, the Sages, and first revealed that Zelda has some innate magic power. She wasn't just a monarch Ganon was holding hostage, she was one of the sages capable of sealing him away, and the only one with the foresight and telepathic powers to kickstart the hero on his quest before it was too late. It's here that we also got our first lore drops that were then expanded on in Ocarina of Time. Ganon used to be Ganondorf. The Triforce was created by a trio of golden goddesses, Den, Nehru, and Varor. Zelda possesses the Triforce of Wisdom, Link the Triforce of Courage, and Ganondorf the Triforce of Power. And only by bringing the three together can someone make their dreams come true. It's also at this time that people started to care about the timeline, and Ocarina of Time was such a landmark title that Nintendo would have been foolish not to capitalize on it. Which is why we had a split in the timeline. One timeline that led to Link to the Past, which states that Ganon was successful in his acquisition of the Triforce and his corruption of the Golden Realm. A second timeline led to Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, which states that Link traveling back in time with Zelda's power prevented Ganondorf from conquering Hyrule. And a third timeline led to Wind Waker, which states that Ganondorf was defeated by the Hero of Time and then both promptly fell off the face of the earth. This strenuous timeline was the norm and further canonized with the release of Skyward Sword, which sought to tell the origin story of all of this. And that's where we get a big revelation about Zelda that maybe didn't have the impact it could have had. Zelda is not just the leader of the Seven Sages, destined to be reborn to seal away the darkness and protect the Triforce of Wisdom. She's also the incarnation of the goddess Hylia. Hylia did not exist until Skyward Sword. The word Hylia had only ever been mentioned a few times in prior games, all of them referring to the place the Hylians were originally from, and the similar looking statue in Zelda 2 was put there as a reference to biblical angels. Hylia is based on the Japanese goddess Amaterasu, which according to legend was the progenitor of the Japanese royal family. Hylia's rivalry with Demise is likewise inspired by Amaterasu's rivalry with Susanoo. So by the time Breath of the Wild came out, we already had a convoluted timeline with strenuous lore built around a weird hybrid pantheon of Japanese Shintoism, Germanic folklore, and Christian themes. Weirder still was that Nintendo was really coy about timeline placement. Ganon being a straight-up monster and the post-apocalyptic vibes were in line with the Fallen timeline, which makes even more sense given that Breath of the Wild was conceptualized as a 3D recreation of the original game's unfettered freedom. The Koroks, Rito, and Leviathan skeletons were all nods to Wind Waker. The Hylian statues in Sealed Temple were airdropped straight from Skyward Sword, and there were explicit references to both Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Through the DLC, there were various outfits and masks based on the prior iterations of Link and the various people he had encountered. Those outfits, along with several special weapons, can now be found in the Depths, a cavernous and darkened version of Hyrule that wasn't in any prior game. Only maybe it was. Link to the Past had the Dark World, a once vibrant golden land that was corrupted by Ganon's malice when he took hold of the Triforce at the start of the Fallen timeline. And wouldn't you know, Link can only get to the Dark World through portals that you can find by lifting rocks. Link Between Worlds is a soft sequel to Link to the Past and features Lorule, an inverted version of Hyrule that can only be accessed through cracks in the landscape. Upon discovering the depths and the amount of Zonai ruins housed there, it's easy to see how such a place could be connected to the Dark World or Lorule. So what gives? Well, like I said from the outset and in the title of the video, while the fandom were busy trying to piece together the history of Hyrule, Hyrule Historia if you will, Nintendo themselves were treating those stories as legends and myths. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are the true stories, for now. Everything that came before were fragmentary pieces of folklore embellished long after the fact. We all grew up playing the in-universe, fictitious accounts of heroes and monsters, and I'm not sure people were quite ready for that level of fantasyception. I honestly can't think of another series that mythologized its own canon to that extent. The closest would be DC Comics, which frequently retcons stories out of existence and replaces them with slimmed down versions of those same stories so that every defining moment in a character's life happened over the course of 5 to 10 years. But even that's just throwing stuff away and only keeping what the writers want to keep. And all of it involves characters that are still around to this day. There's nobody in the Zelda series who was able to witness every major battle between good and evil. Zelda, Ganondorf, Mineru, and the Spirit of Rauru were only able to see the events outlined in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Thanks to Zelda's time travel shenanigans, they were able to learn about the Master Sword, but none of them created it, We know how it came to be in the original timeline, but that no longer applies because we now know the in-universe historical event that inspired Skyward Sword did not involve the Master Sword, which is maddening. In separating fiction from reality and fiction from fiction within fiction, we kind of take for granted that myths and legends were not initially seen as fiction. Myths tend to be explanations on how and why things are the way they are, while legends are a little more grounded in historical events. Every Zelda game has always treated the other Zelda games as legends, but now that we have conflicting origins of Hyrule, Ganon, and the nature of the gods themselves, those legends have turned into myth. It's just really neat that Nintendo found a way to honor their legacy while leaving a lot of wiggle room for future iterations and interpretations of these characters. It's so much more respectful and satisfying than just throwing stuff away or deconstructing what came before or preemptively trivializing everything that the series will ever do. It also makes me wish there was some counterpoint to Tears of the Kingdom, something with a complex mythology that takes those gods and monsters and brings them down to a manageable level without ruining the mystery and intrigue that makes myths and legends so fascinating. Alright, there is such a game! So join me next time when I talk about how Elden Ring is a perfect dark mirror version of Breath of the Wild. I'm Mediocrity4, thanks for watching.